And good evening. It's June 4th, 2024, and we're in our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's a series from the Bible Project, and it's about the entire TaNaK, right? The entire Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK Old Testament source video section, of course, set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. They would be found in the source video playlist. We're going to try to still keep these to around 15, 20 minutes or so, make them easy to catch and possibly easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, right, the Old Testament. Yet, we're going to be doing it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So, might get interesting as we get past the first five. So, TaNaK, Old Testament, Genesis, Bereshit, chapters 1 through 11. Okay, so as we're in this series, I kind of want to remember that there's probably going to be more questions than there are answers, as in maybe at least the ratio of questions and answers. Because we're going to try to respond to some of the information, and as we discuss, I'll leave it for you to determine if it's an answer. But there's going to be a lot of questions. We're going to be asking all kinds of things, of which we're probably not going to know or get an answer. Because it is what it is. Because Genesis 1 through 11, it's going to begin with the simple, beautiful story, and yet so deeply profound, it divides the room. Creation. This topic is so briefly covered in Scripture, and yet can and does divide more rooms than we care to admit. Questions that will probably come up along as we go, but they're not necessarily for answers, but more about what you might think, right? What are you thinking about? Because sadly, I've literally seen folks break off community because someone does not agree with their paradigm about creation. Because I want us, at times, through this entire series, as we're at different places, that we can agree to disagree, and yet continue to discuss. There are so many questions to address in Scripture that have no answer. But that's okay. You know, we've lost more knowledge of history than we'll probably ever know. I would just like us to consider being comfortable with not knowing an answer sometimes, and yet still be along for the journey. I like how Tim said that chapters 1 through 11 as the story of God in the whole world. Then, when we get to chapter 12 through 50, we've narrowed the storyline down to God with Abraham and Abraham's people. So it starts out with a mix of broad and narrow, right? We get all of creation. Then it narrows down to our little couple in the garden. Well, then it expands to their family and then to the cities outside. Then a very wide worldview. And then we narrow right back down to a very narrow story with Noah. Then we get back out wide again with Babel and, of course, the dispersal. And there's a story in the middle of that connects this first section, chapters 1 through 11, with the second section, 12 through 50, although much detail is still missing. But the narrowness of back to one couple, that Abraham and Sarai, We're going to get there. I'm just interested to see what that connector will be. I really do enjoy how Tim and the folks at the Bible Project in particular approach this creation story. That God's there, and there's disorder and chaos, and God is bringing order and calm to this story. God took that, made our world with it, harnessing that disorder into order, and forming the realms. I do love where we get beauty and all of these things that come out of creation. All of that. And then we get to us humans. And like Tim said, and he takes it this way, he says that the human word for Adam, that the Hebrew word is humanity. Adam is being human. So we just call this first human. Sounds a bit impersonal. But then again, it's only him until there's more to the story. So Ish is really the designation for the male of being human. Isha is the female human, because we get that after her creation, because they are part of one. Yeah? You know, the creation verbiage is interesting, since we oft traditionally have been told about Adam's rib. Yet the text, it leans towards the whole side of Adam. Mental pictures, there's probably a bunch of them that are conjuring up in your minds right now. I like that. You know, she is the only creation that did not start from nothing, as in dust. She is actually part of another created being. You know, it's not until after the fall that we eventually get to the word Chava, right? Or Eve. Not really sure how we get to Eve from Chava, because that's the Hebrew word for her. But Adam is the Ish. Chava, but she's the Isha. Or, in the words of Adam, that Isha that God, you, gave me. Funny man, Adam. But the key, or the fun part in realizing that these are the only two creatures in all of creation that are created in God's image. And I'm not compelled by the arms and legs thing. What is part of it is to act like God acts. Because the rest of creation, they can't do that. They cannot act in the capacity that God acts. But they are complete in their part in creation as a whole. We are the ones that are different than the rest. Everything else is meant to, in the space that it has been created, to be all that they're designed to be. You know, oddly enough, we take humans out of the equation. This planet, it would exist. It doesn't need us. That's a thought to ponder. The rest of creation doesn't need us. It can just exist fine without us. But being in God's image, just like it says, that now, in our realm, God created for us to take care of, to subdue, to manage the chaos, to reflect, to show the original whole creation that all the other Ish and Ishas, the character of the Creator. You know, God's part, he says, I've given to you, I've created for you this realm that you can, if you choose, to turn and reflect me on all the rest of creation, all that I've created for you. Again, I like how Tim put it, that we are reflections of God's character. We are representatives of God's rule. We harness creation's potential, and we create beauty in order. I love it put that way. And then we're blessing the blessing, right? That goes on. It's kind of like pay it forward. And he started that by putting them, us, right, in that garden. The garden is interesting because, okay, let's not forget, the story is a backwards look, as in they, right, these children of Israel, they've had a life already. They have actually been exposed to a lot. So God can then use what they might imagine or picture. Kind of like a parable from Jesus, right? They understood the images in the parable, right? There weren't lessons on what to think about those. They understood those images, even if they didn't understand the lessons underneath. But as we know, some of the words in Hebrew, as you are going to see, we're going to hear these words, they evoke imagery, right? Because we're hearing the story well beyond the time frame. Everything that we're going to get from Bereshit, from Genesis, the entire story that Moshe is passing on, it's going to be tied to things that they can already imagine. Because this book, the entire book, but particularly Genesis, it's not a science lesson. It's actually not really at the core, even really a history lesson. It's about God's part in it and how that part gets to you, to them, the children of Israel, to where they are in the wilderness post-Exodus. Because then we get into, then when they get to this, so how does that look? So they can imagine this because we're in a garden. That's the center of this space. Because they, right, the children of Israel, this is not a new image. This is part of a kingdom. The garden in the middle, it's oft at the center. Kingdoms, Egypt included, had beautiful gardens in central areas, right? Those hanging gardens of Babylon, yeah? The sacred space. They were for the king and their courts, and often with a deity ties in, priestly attendants. We're going to even see this imagery later in the story, a few scrolls from now with the tabernacle, because this is the imagery that they would be drawing from. We have this special area, this Garden of Eden, which means there's an Eden. It's the Garden of. Hope that makes sense. But this area in the middle of Eden, this Garden of Eden, this is a sacred space. It's in the center of it all. And the most beautiful and of value are inside there. So it seems Adam and Chava are attendants, right? They're priestly roles in this sacred space. So this is special. Because remember, choice is part of the character of God. Real, true choice. Because God, He chose to make us. He wanted to create a space outside of the heavenly realm. That's for another discussion. But we're given the blessing of free will to freely and openly choose. That's only given to humans. Instinct does not drive us. It can, at times, weigh heavily in a protection scenario, right? Maslow's hierarchy leaps to my mind. But we are still driven by that choice, that God-created, God-given choice. It's all over all over the scrolls, just from chapter 2 in Genesis, and it moves onwards. We are in God's image. And by default, that's a beautiful and wonderful creation. It's capable of so much. It's given the tools and the resources for so much. Our design is absolutely amazing. And I love, again, how Tim put it, right? That we get the freedom and dignity of the choice, that God is honoring us by giving us his choice. So I guess a base point would be, are we going to trust God's definition of that? Or do we define our own? Well, looking back where we're sitting now, 2,000 plus years past Messiah, I think we understand what our pension is. Okay, so we're going to get more into the garden activities as part of next week. So it's going to leave a lot more questions out on the table because things are going to come up we don't understand. So thanks for with us tonight as we begin this whole section on another edition of Outside the Class, the TaNaK, the Old Testament with Bereshit on the Dusty Feet.